Hitler had gambled. He had naturally been building up his forces for years. At that point, it must be said that they were being built up from practically nil, though, since according to the Versailles Treaty, Germany could not have a standing army that would number more than 100,000 men. There were limits on, there was no air force was allowed, and various other limitations on Germany's military capabilities. However, after Hitler came to power, he started disregarding these provisions of the Versailles Treaty. And what is also worth mentioning here is that he received a lot of help from the Russians in doing so. And this was actually a German and Soviet policy that predated Hitler's rise to power. This was a cooperation that was already taking place between Weimar Germany and Soviet Russia in the late 1920s. However, Hitler had, as I mentioned, gambled. It wasn't the first time that he did it during the war. He had done it with,
the occupation of the Rhineland.
The occupation of the Rhineland.
The German army said to Hitler, no, we can't because the French army will defeat us. We're not ready. And of course, Hitler said, well, they won't fight.
Absolutely.
And of course, each time they didn't fight, it meant the fighting the next time would become even less likely, which is remarkable when you think about the Maginot Line, for example. This huge defensive fortification. And the French did have an extremely capable, well, not capable as the history has shown us, but extremely large army. And yet, for some reason, there had been a collapse of national willpower.
This was the problem, because technically they were capable. They were well trained. They had all the necessary equipment. When we look at just the number of tanks, artillery pieces, divisions, the French army was very impressive when it came to manpower. But as you mentioned, their spirit had been broken in the First World War. Even if they had managed to win in the end with great sacrifice by French soldiers, for some reason they are slightly ignored in the historiography of many parts of the world, where the American offensive in 1917, with all these hundreds of thousands of American troops arriving in Europe and joining the war, is often mentioned as one of the reasons for why the Entente managed to win the war. The British sacrifice in Somme and many other places is also often mentioned, but for some reason we do tend to forget just how many French soldiers sacrificed their lives in the First World War and how staunchly they resisted. But it is true that during the last months of the war, the war fatigue in France was enormous. And in the years after the war, there was this national debate going on just how much they had lost during the war. And it created this environment in which, later, as it was said, in the lead up to the Second World War, who is prepared to die for Gdansk or for Danzig?
Well, indeed, because we forget now, because it's we don't think about it necessarily, that for the people making the politicians making the decisions in the run up to the Second World War, were people whose family members, who were probably, some of them had fought in the First World War. One thinks particularly of British Foreign Minister Sir Anthony Eden, as he became, who not only himself had fought in the First World War, interestingly had fought in the same sector as the front of Adolf Hitler, but who himself, I think, lost two brothers in the First World War. And many other politicians were similarly afflicted. So you can understand how they would have seen firsthand the horrors of war and would have done almost anything as they tried to avoid this being repeated again in their lifetimes. And as a postscript, Anthony Eden lost his only son in the Second World War. So you know, people say, oh, appeasement, weren't they terrible? But you can understand why, if you've been through something terrible like the First World War, you would not want to inflict that on your population a second time in less than a generation.
Naturally, psychologically, it all makes sense. However, if you are a great statesman, which naturally every statesman should aspire to be, then you also need to have foresight, and you have to have what the Germans call Fingergespitzengefühl, that you can feel with your fingers the small details that are necessary in world politics. One of those opportunities that were lost was in 1934.